morning, good afternoon, or evening, wherever you might be joining from. My name is Anael Burrow, and I am the president of Loyola's International Student Association. On behalf of ISA and Loyola's Center for International Education, I want to welcome you to Social Justice and International Education, a Call to Action. Today's event will feature a talk by our guest speaker, Dr. LaNitra Berger, followed by a Q&A session. You are invited to type your questions into the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. Today's talk will be recorded for anyone who was unable to join us and will be available afterwards. This event is part of Loyola's International Education Week 2020, which is a week of international programming celebrated by universities around the world. It is part of a larger initiative that is co-sponsored by the U.S. Departments of State and Education. For more information about Loyola's events this week, please visit our website at www.loyno.edu/CIE. We believe that during the pandemic, international events like this one that are being organized by universities around the world are more important now than ever. Thank you for being part of this event and for continuing global conversations and connections during the pandemic. With that, I would like to turn over to Marriott Thomas, the Director of the Center of International Education, to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that warm welcome, Anael, and thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today. It's my great privilege to introduce our speaker. We're very fortunate to have Dr. LaNitra Berger join us today during what must be a very busy International Education Week. Dr. Berger is well known in the field of international education as a great advocate for social justice. She's an exemplary leader in the field, continuously raising important issues of diversity and inclusion. And I'd like to quickly share Dr. Berger's bio with you. At this time, Dr. Berger is the Senior Director of the Office of Fellowships in the Office of Undergraduate Education at George Mason University. In this role, she leads one of the few fellowship offices with a social justice focus. Throughout her career, she has worked toward helping underrepresented students gain access to transformational educational opportunities. Since starting at Mason in 2010, Dr. Berger has helped secure more than 50 prestigious national scholarships and fellowships, such as the Boren, Fulbright, Truman, Critical Language Scholarship, many of whom are first-generation low-income or minority students. She received the Spirit of King Award and the Margaret C. Howell Award for her work at Mason to diversify education abroad. Dr. Berger serves on several advisory boards, including NAFSA, Association of International Educators, the AAFS Academic Advisory Board, and Globalize DC. She previously served as the Director of Leadership and International Programs at the National Association for Equal Opportunity in Higher Education, where she organized 3 national dialogues on diversity in international education, which brought together historically Black college presidents, federal agencies, and nonprofit leaders to improve access to study abroad. Dr. Berger received her MA and PhD in art history from Duke University and a bachelor's degree in art history and international relations from Stanford University. She studied abroad in Paris, was an exchange student in Berlin, and conducted field research in South Africa. She's the author of 2 books, Exploring Education Abroad, a guide for racial and ethnic minority participants, published in 2016, and the monograph Irma Stern and the Racial Paradox of South African Modern Art, Audacities of Color, which is published this month. She's also the editor of a new book, Social Justice and International Education, Research, Practice, and Perspectives, which came out in September and really highlighted for us the importance of having her during this year's International Education Week. Dr. Berger, I want to warmly welcome you today. We are so grateful to you for taking the time to join us. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Marriott, for the invitation, for the warm introduction, and the warm virtual welcome to Loyola, to the students and faculty and staff who are joining us today. I'm so pleased to be able to speak to you during International Education Week as we come together as a community traditionally this week to focus on our field and exchange and the value of what we do and the work that we do. I believe that 2020 is a very auspicious time for us to be coming together to discuss these issues, because this has been one of the most challenging years for international education and exchange, as well as one of the most challenging years of facing racial and social justice. So the fact that this book came out in September, it came out at just the right time for us to really focus on what we can do as international educators to make this kind of change that we all want to see, and that we all believe as international educators that this is why we do this work, because we see how transformative it is for students. I also want to say thank you to Anael for the lovely speech at the beginning, and how important it is for our international students in particular to be celebrated, supported, and know that they are welcomed on our college campuses. So it's great to see international students thriving and being part of the community, because they are a crucial part of our communities across the country. So, so thank you for your presence here today. The title of my talk today is Social Justice and International Education, a Call to Action. So today we're going to focus mostly on the second part, the call to action. We're living through two pandemics right now, COVID-19 and racism. And we're learning that we can't escape either. There's nowhere you can go in this country or in this world and not see people who are worried or concerned or trying to protect themselves from COVID, or are either the victims of racism or are perpetuating racism in some way. So there's really no way for us to escape these issues, which means that this is really the time for us to confront them both and to take decisive action to make change. So, you know, there's been a lot of news and activity this month on a variety of fronts that will give us some amount of hope for the future in terms of being able to expand our work and to be able to welcome and support international students the way we would like to. But make no mistake, we should not assume that because there will be a change of presidential administration, that's a time to then sit back again and be complacent. The issues are there. They were there before, they will be there after. And so it's really important that we make a commitment today and every day to advance this agenda in a way that will help us promote equity and equitable access for all of our students. So this summer we saw the seismic outcome of the police murders of Black people in public on camera. And this is the first time in recent memory, if not ever, that we have had to, as a nation, accept that white supremacy is a part of the foundations of this country. And it's not only an element of our lives here at home, but is also a foundation of many places and overseas as well. And now that we're coming to grips with this as a full nation and starting to understand what the implications of that are, we've also had to accept that white supremacy doesn't just look like someone who's wearing a KKK uniform from the Ku Klux Klan. That's a very outdated view of what that looks like. White supremacy is a supervisor who refuses to promote a talented Black employee. White supremacy is someone who assumes that every person of Hispanic origin is in a service role. It's someone who discriminates against people of Asian background or descent because they believe that they are responsible for bringing COVID to the United States. All of these behaviors are born out of ignorance, but they're nurtured and supported by a power structure whose foundation is white supremacy, and that transcends nations and continents. So the recognition of white supremacy's international reach is a significant step in our global efforts to confront systemic racism and work towards equity and access for all. So there's no more important time than right now to be working towards social justice. And today I'm going to give you some remarks and insights from my edited book, Social Justice in International Education, Research, Practice, and Perspectives, to give you an overview of the book and what's in it, hopefully to encourage you to buy the book. There's over 30 different chapter authors here with so many different perspectives that I could never capture the entire essence of the book in a talk. But I'll give you a good enough sense of it that you can delve into specific chapters in more detail. First, what I'm going to do is start with a short reading from the book. And I have some questions that I'll ask you to think about after that's finished. So I wrote the introduction to the book, and that introduction, the full introduction, is actually available on the NAFSA website if you want to read the whole thing. But I'm going to read from the very beginning of the introduction to set the stage for how I approach this topic as the editor, and then I'll tell you why I believe that this approach for me was most important in how we talk about this subject. Okay, so during the 1930s and 1940s, German Jewish scholars were expelled from their academic posts in German universities by the Nazi regime. Becoming refugees and in danger of being deported to concentration camps, many academics pleaded for asylum in the United States and requested teaching appointments in American colleges and universities. Many universities did not offer these scholars positions, and the scholars were denied entry into the United States. The exception was a group of historically Black colleges and universities, or HBCUs, institutions that were founded to educate the sons and daughters of American slaves. HBCUs offered teaching positions to approximately 50 German Jewish refugee scholars in fields ranging from mathematics to visual art. Part of the core educational mission of these institutions was to address social inequality and to work towards racial justice. Administrators at HBCUs saw an opportunity to extend this commitment by welcoming refugee scholars to their campuses. Merging international education and social justice ideals led to extraordinary results. The Jewish scholars provided HBCU students with a high-quality education, which the students could not have accessed elsewhere in the United States. Shocked by the segregation and racial violence in the South, many refugee scholars observed chilling parallels to the anti-Semitism they had left behind in Europe. Some were compelled to encourage students to resist racism by protesting segregation laws and participating in the civil rights movement. In this case, HBCUs set an example by providing refuge to German Jewish scholars, who in turn taught Black students to use their critical thinking skills to challenge white supremacy. So that's how I open up the book. And so why would I pick this example? Well, first of all, every time I read this beginning, it sounds more like it could have come from this year. Just in terms of the ways that we have changed our immigration and asylum policies, and people escaping persecution in other places have had difficulties coming to the United States. So I see a lot of the past in the present. I also want to highlight the importance of our nation's historically Black colleges and their leadership in international education from their founding. Oftentimes, there's a perception that HBCUs are running at a deficit and that they are behind other institutions, or that they're not as committed to international education. And that's simply not true. From their beginnings, HBCUs have had to facilitate study abroad for their students because students were unable to pursue graduate education at most white universities. And so in order to be able to get additional training, Black people, Black students had to go overseas to do that. So the engagement with the world is baked into the HBCU mission, and not very many people understand that. So I want to bring that to light. This example is also very personal to me because my mother attended Tennessee State University, which is an HBCU. And at that institution, she took math classes from one of the German Jewish refugee scholars. And it was through taking this class and engaging with this professor that she became inspired to major in math and study math. She wanted to get a PhD in math, and at the time, Emory University was the place to do that in the South, but they did not admit Black people. So her dream was deferred and ultimately denied. So I first learned about these scholars as a young person, as a very young person, through her describing how much she learned, not only from an academic mathematics standpoint from the scholars, but also from their constant pushing of the students not to accept the position that they were in the segregated South. So that was always something that really drove me and shaped me as a person as I began working with historically Black colleges as well. So, international education and exchange have an important role to play in cultivating social justice movements, as they've done for centuries. So Dr. Martin Luther King, for example, had been to India, and that's where he understood the concept of nonviolent resistance and how he could apply it here in the United States. Black feminist scholar Audre Lorde developed a liberation philosophy that supported the development of Afro-German consciousness through the time that she lived in Berlin. So this combination of social justice and international education is very natural. It's very natural for people to see those two things together. Social movements don't develop in isolation. And now in an age of the internet and smartphones and easy access to people through social media, that is becoming even more of the case. And so as educators, as students, we really want to think about how we can use the tools that we have to be able to facilitate these types of interactions and work towards social justice. So my work actually focuses on paradoxes. So as Mariette mentioned, I just wrote a book that's coming out that talks about a racial paradox in South African modern art. So I'm interested in the idea of paradoxes, and what I'm interested in about paradoxes is that we oftentimes think that paradoxes are things that we just have to accept and sit with, that this is the way it is. But I actually think that paradoxes themselves are catalysts for change. And so what I'm looking at is how you can take a paradox and turn it into a paradigm shift. And one example of that in the realm of what we do as international educators is thinking about something like the Fulbright Program. I love the Fulbright Program. I'm a Fulbright Program advisor. I spend a lot of time recruiting students and supporting them on Fulbright. And I've done some work with the State Department specifically to help them broaden their outreach to underrepresented students. So this is a program that's near and dear to my heart. But one thing that's always bothered me about the program is that I understand the dual legacies of Senator J. William Fulbright. So J. William Fulbright was a senator from Arkansas who developed the vision for the Fulbright program after World War II. He wanted to find a way for people to have mutual exchange and to be able to talk to each other and to learn from each other as a preventative measure of not having nuclear war, World War III. And so he had this brilliant idea that if you just got people together and they talked about research or they talked about topics of interest to them, that they would start to get to know each other more personally, and they would be less likely to commit acts of violence against each other. It's a great idea. But while he was able to envision this fantastic program that is now 75 years old, Senator Fulbright also was a segregationist here in the United States. He signed the Southern Manifesto and he believed in segregation. And he held these two views at the same time. So mutual exchange was something that was important to do overseas, but it was not important for two people living, a few blocks away from each other to really be able to see each other and get to know each other. So, I'm really interested in this paradox. How could he want this, this big program to be created, but not share water fountains with people just because of the color of their skin? At the same time, 75 years after the Fulbright program was founded, it is this amazing international exchange program that is the example is set around the world. People admire this program. The name has so much meaning and cachet. It's produced thousands of alumni from different backgrounds, people who have gone on to be world leaders and professors and do amazing things. So what was at once a horrible paradox has become a paradigm shift. And the Fulbright program, I would say, is a leader in trying to figure out how to broaden its outreach and to bring more people into the conversation. So one of the things that I've done over the last 3 or 4 years now that I'm extremely proud of is worked with Fulbright alumni to create an Instagram platform called Fulbright Noir. And that started out with a group of students who felt like they wanted to see more of students like them participate in the program, and that they had a lot of questions about going overseas and they didn't know who to ask. So they turned to Instagram, and if you go to Fulbright Noir now, you'll see all of these wonderful examples of students talking about their experiences, students connecting across the platform. And not only that, but Fulbright Noir inspired other groups to create platforms. So there's Fulbright Prism for the LGBTQIA+ community. There's Fulbright Salam, Fulbright Lotus, Fulbright Mariposa. And so one group created a bunch of other groups. And now there's just a flourishing of different experiences on the Fulbright, and the Fulbright no longer looks monolithic. It looks like the living, breathing international exchange program that it is. And so for what we do as international educators, I really believe that that's a great example of taking a paradox and turning it into a paradigm shift. So today, I'm going to give you that call to action. I want you to think about what is one thing that you can do tonight, tomorrow, the next day, to advance the cause of social justice and international education. And I'm going to pull out 3 themes from the book that I think really encapsulate some of the most important issues. So the book is divided into 3 sections: research, practice, and perspectives. The research chapter, the research section is scholars who are thinking broadly and theoretically about these 2 concepts and how they fit together. The practitioner section is some of the leading people who actually run programs or are doing the day-to-day advising, and ideas that they have for everything from pre-departure orientation activities to how to support Black international students on your campus. The 3rd section is called perspectives, and those are short essays written by people across the spectrum. So community activists, K through 12 educators, Diversity Abroad CEO wrote an essay. And then the book concludes with a poem read by the Irish poet Pádraig Ó Tuama that he composed just for this book that I think really ties everything together. So I will share my screen right now. And what I have are just some pictures that illustrate the concepts that I'm talking about. Let's play this from the start. Okay, and these are pictures. The pictures that I'm going to show you are pictures that I took from the study abroad program that I ran in the summer of 2018 called Monuments, Museums, and Memory in South Africa. So the 3 concepts I'm going to talk to you today are power, comfort, and ignorance. All right, so power. Power decides who has privilege. It decides who has the dominant view and can establish the dominant narrative in society, and it provides a dominant view of social identity and social hierarchy. So power is a really important element when we're thinking about social justice. And when we want to empower our students to be social justice advocates, and we want to empower ourselves, we have to understand power. We have to understand our relationship to power in any given situation. We have to understand the people who are in power and what's on their minds. And we have to understand how we can relate those 2 things together. the most important thing that we have to understand is that we should never be afraid of power. That is how power is able to exert undue influence on people. So challenging power structures is a very important aspect of social justice. The reason why I have this picture here is that this is a picture of my son, Nathan, when he was 7 years old. And I taught this course in Cape Town and Johannesburg, and I brought my 2 children with me on the trip. And that did a lot of things for me. I was nervous about teaching with 2 kids in tow, but I also, for my sons to see me as an educator really helped establish my role as not just a mother, but as a working person, as a thinking working person. And so that was, you know, important for them to see as well. So we happened to be in Johannesburg on Nelson Mandela's birthday, July 18th, 2018. And that happened to be his 100th birthday. So as you can imagine, there was a huge, huge birthday party for Nelson Mandela in Soweto on his street, which is called Vilakazi Street. And so you could go to the Nelson Mandela house, and they allowed children to go in the house and have a piece of birthday cake. So unlike a lot of museums in the United States where everything's roped off, you can't get close, you can touch a lot of things in museums there, for better or for worse. And so the picture that you see is of my son having a slice of birthday cake for Nelson Mandela's birthday at Nelson Mandela's personal desk in front of Nelson Mandela's personal picture of him being released from prison. So this is a picture, this was a moment that I don't think either of us will ever forget, because it was so moving and it was so poignant for us to be there on that day. But the lesson that I wanted him to learn in that situation was that I wanted him to understand his relationship to power. That, you know, these people are towering figures. We think of them in history as being these giants, but they're also people. People who you can access, people who you can find a way to talk to. And, you know, for him to be able to get that close and to really absorb the moment was really important for me. And I hope for him in understanding that he feels empowered to stand up and talk and speak up. Many times, especially for people of color, people of first generation, they feel in the higher education setting that their level on the social rung is so low because they're new to this environment, because they're not professors, they don't have PhDs, that they can't go and talk to their professors, that they can't talk to administrators, that they can't express their opinions and their concerns. And so they hide a lot of things and many times don't participate in opportunities just because they're afraid to ask questions. They're afraid of not looking smart or having to divulge that they don't know something. And so we really want to encourage our students to not be afraid of power, to ask questions. If the university president is having an open session or a town hall, our students need to feel that they can go there and that they can ask and that they can express their concerns. And really be able to take charge of their education and really have an understanding that the world is theirs to explore and to understand and to make change in. The next idea is comfort. And I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Moray J. Beauchamp-Bird from the University of Tampa, for really having some deep conversations with me recently about this idea, because it's something that I think is really important for us to consider in our own lives, but also as a broader concept. And yesterday, as some of you know or may have participated, NAFSA had an e-meeting for International Education Week that focused on my book. And I had the chance to interview Michelle Norris from NPR. And it was an amazing opportunity to hear her insights. And she also spoke about the importance of comfort and discomfort. Comfort is a function of privilege in many ways. And so, we use this term a lot about we want people to get out of their comfort zones, that we want people to push their boundaries. But really, people want to feel comfortable. If they can at all do it, it is natural for people to want to feel comfortable. But as I mentioned, there's a lot about comfort that is connected to privilege. So, comfort allows you to let your guard down and to reveal things that you wouldn't necessarily reveal in other situations. And it can reveal biases that are inherent into our social identities. This can manifest itself in a couple of ways. Number one would be in the way some students treat faculty of color differently. So they may talk to them in a certain way, they may be disrespectful, they may give them lower teaching evaluations. And you want people to think about, you want students to think about this, like why do you feel comfortable talking to a professor of color in this way when you wouldn't talk to a senior white male professor in that way? Why would you treat someone with less respect? The same with international students as well on campus. Why would we treat them any differently? They're in a position on campus where they're more vulnerable. This is not their home country or their home environment, and they're new to this place. And so why would someone exploit that situation? And why would they feel comfortable in doing that? What is empowering them to feel that way? There's a lot of our bias and privilege, and quite frankly, a lot of white supremacy that is in there. Alternatively, the other side of it is discomfort. Many students think that if they're paying tuition, that they should, this is a transactional situation, that higher education is you pay your tuition, you do some classes, and then you get a degree and you move on. But you shouldn't really be that much different when you graduate than when you started. But we know that that's not the point. That is not the point of higher education. That is definitely not the point of international education. That the whole idea is for you to be uncomfortable and to explore that discomfort and think about the sources and the origins of that discomfort. And hopefully when you come out of that sense of discomfort, you have a greater understanding of the communities that you're in and the cultures that you've engaged with, and how you will engage differently when you go to a different place. Being uncomfortable is a sign that you're growing and that you're learning new skills, that you're studying a new language, that you make mistakes. When I studied abroad in Berlin, I routinely referred to the top that goes on your coffee as a top instead of a Deckel. And people would laugh at me, and I didn't really know why until somebody finally took the opportunity to tell me that a top is the top of a pot. A Deckel is the name for the lid. And, I was mortified that I had gone so long by saying this and that people were laughing at me, but I never forgot the difference after that. So, this is all part of what this is, what the higher education experience is. So this picture here is of my students in Cape Town taking a tour of unknown, lesser known monuments in the city. And this was a monument to children in Cape Town in the 19th century, children throughout South Africa who had been taken and from their families and adopted, often by white families. And those children were taken from their parents, their culture was disrupted, they lost contact with their families, and it was a very horrible thing that happened. And so this monument talks about that history and tries to pay respects to those children who were affected. And we were in Cape Town in early July, and at the same time in the United States, that was when the news of the children being separated at the borders and put into these detention facilities was coming out. So the students were in South Africa learning about this particular historical moment in South Africa, and at the same time connecting back to news at home of these horrific crimes that were happening here in the United States, and they were trying to make sense of that. And they were really thinking for themselves as well about how do I understand my privilege as an American citizen? What is my privilege? How do I stand up and act as an American citizen? I'm in this new environment and I see that this is happening, but I have the power as an American citizen to speak up against this back at home. So we were really wrestling with these issues cross-culturally at that particular moment in the class. So the third point that I want to talk about today, this is going to be the most important thing I talk about, but it's going to be difficult as well. It's the idea of ignorance. This picture here is a picture of Cecil John Rhodes, the diamond and gold magnate who was British but made his fortunes in South Africa on the De Beers mines. And this is a monument to Cecil Rhodes. It's on a hill in Cape Town. And at the time, just his nose had been lopped off. I think he's now been completely beheaded after this summer. But this monument, and there are many monuments to Cecil Rhodes throughout Cape Town. One thing I noticed in the city is that people talk a lot about Cecil Rhodes and the legacy that he left behind, but very few people outside of the United States understand him in any way other than the Rhodes Scholarship. But even fewer people really understand the extent to which he was directly responsible for the brutal murders of so many Black workers who worked in these mines, and how committed he was to the project of white supremacy. And so I was really concerned when I lived in South Africa that when I would have contact with white South Africans of a certain generation, they would all say that they really had no idea how bad things were during apartheid. They had their lives that they lived. They usually had Black women working as domestic workers in their homes, but they had no idea that most Black people lived in treacherous and horrible conditions in townships. And so they, said that there was no way for them to know and that they didn't know. And I just thought that was so mystifying. But in 2012, a scholar named Melissa Stein wrote an article called The Ignorance Contract, where she then goes through and studies this concept of ignorance to help explain why so many white South Africans don't understand their own history. And she coined this term, the ignorance contract, because what she's talking about is actually an epistemology of ignorance. And she's describing ignorance not as a lapse in cognition, but instead as what she says is, quote, a social achievement with strategic value. So ignorance is not something that happens in your mind chemically. It's actually a strategy that you use to continue to hold on to your power and your privilege, to continue to hold on to the comforts that you have in your life, that you know enough to know that you don't want to know anymore. So, think about how many times have you had an event or said something in class about an area, it's usually connected to Africa, or to Black history, where people will say, I had no idea that this happened. I had no idea. And it's great to be able to open people's minds in this regard, but it's also disturbing. When I teach African art. I'm teaching a class that's covering all the cultures and histories of an entire continent from the beginning of time to now. Whereas some of my other colleagues teach 15th century Florentine art. I'm covering all of this stuff. So I have these students who, one, don't know that Africa is a continent. They think it's a country. And they certainly don't know anything else about its history. And I'm in Fairfax County, which claims to have one of the best educational systems in the country. So I ask students to think about, why is it that you don't know? Why do you know so much about European history, but you can't name one capital city in Africa? Why is that? And I really want students to think about that. You know, why is it that this summer we had no idea that there were so few Black CEOs of major companies? You know, or how many things in our everyday lives that Black people invented, like Alice Parker, who invented the furnace, or Garrett Morgan, who invented the 3-point traffic signal. We have no idea that these things are happening, and the question is why? So, you know, ignorance is not an excuse for inaction, particularly now, because we live in the age of the internet, where if we want to know something, we can find it. And we can find it in the comfort of our own home, wherever we want. So there's really not an excuse for not knowing. And I believe that intellectual curiosity is both a powerful tool for social justice, but also has been inequitably distributed. So some students who have privilege are allowed to be intellectually curious. They have the resources to take supplemental classes or to travel and to see different things and just to be able to ask questions and have teachers entertain those questions. Other students who are disproportionately students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, go to schools where the emphasis is on discipline and rote learning. And there is no you know, real curiosity or development of intellectual curiosity that's there. And so I really believe that as educators and as international educators, we need to understand the power of intellectual curiosity in terms of our work. For me, intellectual curiosity is the first thing I look for in a student. That tells me if I see a student who's intellectually curious, I know that I can work to get that student to go abroad. That's all I need. It doesn't matter what major you are. It doesn't matter what your GPA is to me, really. If you're intellectually curious, then there's a way that we can get you abroad. So to me, I think that's a really important thing to think about. So just to conclude, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen now to come back. Just to conclude, there's 3 things I want us to think about as international educators and advisors as we're going through this work. Number 1, we need to abolish the deficit mindset. Every student, regardless of their background, regardless of their GPA, regardless of what kind of education they've had before, has the potential to participate in education abroad. And we have to make sure that we provide them with the advising and the resources to do that. So HBCUs have been very good at this from the beginning because that's mostly who they educate, people who are coming from backgrounds that are historically disadvantaged. And they take those students and they work with them. We have to think about that as a broader model for advising and education abroad. We don't want to look at a student and say, oh, you know, you're from inner city Baltimore, you've never left your home community, it's going to be very difficult for you to study abroad. Instead, we have to turn around and think about it. What kinds of knowledge and expertise does that student bring from their specific environment that can make them successful? And let's get that list down and help that student think about all the different ways that their particular life story has prepared them for this moment. Now, you know, we can talk in the Q&A about all the things that we have to do as advisors to get them there. But to me, this is the key to addressing underrepresentation. And frankly, it's the right thing to do. Number 2, the student experience really matters. How students are treated inside the classroom and outside the classroom is crucial. We don't want students to feel marginalized. We don't want them to feel like they're not being engaged. So we really want to encourage faculty to talk to that student, the student who looks like maybe they're dozing off in class, or maybe their language quizzes are not that great. It could be that the student is working a couple of different jobs in order to pay their tuition. They really like the content. They really like you as a professor, but they're just so busy. We want that student to feel a sense of empowerment that they can make this happen. And sometimes we have to adjust our expectations for students, meaning that if we want all students to go abroad for a semester or even a summer, maybe we work on how we get a student abroad for a week and fit it in that way. But to have that student have that experience where they get on a plane or go to another country and experience a different environment is key. The third thing that I want to say, which is the final thing, which is the most important, is that I don't want anybody to think that if you're not Black or a person of color, if you're not from a marginalized group, that you cannot do this work. So we cannot put this burden only on people of color to solve a problem that they themselves did not create. It's going to take all of us to solve this problem. And sometimes people say to me, well, you know, I didn't have these challenges as a student, so why would a student expect, you know, to hear from me? We're international educators. That's what our expertise is. And so we can advise all of our students. And so I want people to feel empowered from reading the book and from our discussion today that you're problem solvers. You have worked through any number of logistical, financial, administrative challenges to get students abroad. But it's really just that planting that spark in a student who's never ever thought about getting on an airplane. If you can go to that student and say, hey, have you ever considered studying abroad? You would be surprised at how few students have been engaged in that kind of a conversation and what it means. And that it doesn't matter who that message comes from. What matters is that they receive that message and that they're supported. So I want you all to know and understand that this work is going to take all of us. We are not going to diversify our faculty fast enough to have all faculty of color do this. And even if we did, we wouldn't want to put that burden just on them. This is for everybody. This is a problem that we all have to come together to solve. And I'm confident that if we all roll our sleeves up and get to work, we can make that progress. So that is the end of my remarks. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to have discussion and take questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Berger, for that really thought-provoking and inspiring talk. You raised a lot of good points and questions for us to be thinking about, and you're certainly making me think much more deeply about what we can do better to address issues of underrepresentation and inequality in international education. So thank you for that. If anyone has any questions at this point, you have a couple of options. You're welcome to go ahead and type them into the Q&A box or into the chat. You can also click on the option to raise your hand, and we will unmute you and invite you to share aloud any comments or questions that you have for our speaker. My colleague Wyatt Boykin is also going to help me moderate the chat, the Q&A, and any hands that are raised. Can give folks a minute or so in case they are typing. I'm interested, LaNitra, I can jump in with a quick question. Since you have led groups of students abroad, if you could talk a little bit about what you've done as a program leader or what advice you have for practitioners about making sure that your program has been accessible to a variety of students, including those typically underrepresented in study abroad.
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks. So I had two purposes of teaching my class in South Africa. The first was my academic interest in public monuments and memorials in South Africa. But the second was actually an exercise as an administrator. Could I design a program that would speak to these alternative narratives and would therefore also appeal to underrepresented students? So I had a co-teacher, a fantastic colleague and friend, T. Gary Davis, who works in our multicultural affairs office. So we co-taught the class together. He had lived in South Africa for 6 or 7 years and got a master's degree there. So we would talk all the time about how much fun it would be for us to lead this trip. So we designed the course together, and his background was public health in South Africa, particularly AIDS awareness. And so right there, you have 2 Black faculty leading a trip, which is unusual. And I then recruited from my classes, which are African art classes or African American history classes. And so we ended up with 4 students on that program. 2 were African American, 3 were first generation. We had an athlete. Across the 4 of them, they hit all of the underrepresented identities you could imagine. I think 3 of them were STEM majors. So it was a really interesting case study to see what we could do. And you know, it was fantastic. I actually, 2 of them were freshmen who are still just with me. They're my mentees now. But you know, one of them was just extremely financially under-resourced and, you know, didn't necessarily have the same amount of money as the other students did. So there was a lot of calibration throughout the time that we were together, and thinking about how do you make the program equitable so that no one feels like they can't afford the lunch? How do you make it so that people can have really great conversations? And then, of course, the topic, public monuments and memorials, you know, there's a way that you could teach it that would adhere to the dominant narrative. And then there's the way that I taught it, which was really to spend most of our time in the townships. I had one of the founders of the Roads Must Fall movement speak to the students twice to ground them in that sense of activism. And so, you know, there's a lot that we were trying to do. There's maybe some things I would do differently when I teach the course again, but I really learned a lot about how underrepresentation manifests itself in a group dynamic, and also, you know, the importance of having people of color leading study abroad programs.
Dr. Berger, if I could jump in here real quick. Hi, all. I'm Wyatt, the Q&A behind the scenes guy. Can you see the Q&A box, Dr. Berger?
Let me open it up. Okay.
Okay, because there's 2 questions in there for you.
Oh. Uh-oh.
And if you prefer, I can just read you the questions and let you answer.
Yeah, could you please, because they're not showing up here.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'll just turn my video off again. So the first question comes from Jenny, and she says, I wonder if you have any thoughts about how you connect this call to action for social justice to incoming study abroad students, that is, international students coming into the US for study abroad.
Okay, good question, Jenny. So I will point out 2 chapters in the book that cover this question, because I think it's a really important question. First of all, I'll say that it's really important in your orientations, especially now, that you help students understand both the current moment that we're in the United States and historically. And so if you can bring in a faculty member who can set that context, I think that's great. International students can get into a lot of trouble if they just show up to a place that's in turmoil and they have no understanding of how to respond. That being said, they also bring such important insights from their own cultures that, you know, problems that we think are unsolvable, maybe they've seen another way where in the countries they live in. So it's also important that we give them a voice to let them, you know, talk about their observations of our country. One of the things that can be really challenging, especially where you all are in New Orleans, is when you bring African or Caribbean students to your campus, and suddenly they're racialized for the very first time in a way that's unfamiliar to them. So in their countries, they are in the majority, they're around mostly Black people, and then they come to a place where they're in the minority and they're seen as African American, and they have no idea what that experience is. And that can be destabilizing, it can be frightening, it can make it hard for them to really have an understanding of how they fit into their host country. Dr. Shante Delalue from Brown University wrote a chapter specifically about that, in the book, as did Crystal George Mwangi and her co-authors wrote about using critical race theory from the United States to look at how African students are racialized. So I think it's important for international students to understand that that they bring a fresh, new perspective to the United States. That's why we want them to come. We want to hear how other people see our world and show us something different. But we also want to be mindful of helping them create a positive experience through giving them some deeper background and understanding of the environment in which they're arriving in.
Great, thank you. We're getting close to the end of the hour, so I'm going to jump in with another question from Nina, who writes, current study abroad typically involves people of the North going abroad. Are there efforts to reverse that trend, i.e. upend the privilege?
So you mean that it's mostly like people from the United States and Europe studying abroad? So how do we look at getting people from the African continent and other places? Is that roughly what they're saying?
Yes, that's more or less how I understand it.
Okay. Yeah, so we need to fix the mobility issues. A lot of those issues are related to access and finances. So if there's any way that universities can provide scholarships for students who don't have the means to pay full freight, fully understanding that for a lot of institutions, the international students are part of a financial strategy. So I understand that that's partially why they're recruited, but there needs to be a broader social and intellectual project going on with having international students on campus. And just in the same way that we don't want only rich American students to be able to attend American universities, we should have some mechanism to allow students from other countries who can't afford to come here to be able to do that. So I think that's part of the mobility issue. The other issue is that people in marginalized places in other parts of the world don't always have a good understanding of the different types of programs that are available. So one thing that I was doing when I was at NAFIO was helping the REACTs get information about HBCUs. Those are institutions where, you know, if you're an international student, you're looking to go abroad, that might be a good place for you to not only study in the sciences, but also be in a majority Black institution. So, you know, helping people to understand that the breadth and type of institutions is really important. So I think there's a lot of risk taking there, and financially it may not look like it's worth it, but I believe that it's important to go and recruit from those other areas.
Mariette, do you think we have time for one more question, or
Yeah.
right at the end?
Yeah, I think one more will be fine.
Okay. Let's go, Dr. Berger, let's go to a question in the chat box from Jordan. Jordan says, or asks, do you have any thoughts on addressing concerns of racial tensions and acceptance in host countries of study abroad? I'm an advisor / recruiter for a program in Europe. Many of the students of color I work with are wary of being accepted there. I have some decide to participate, but I often have students who never consider it because of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a real concern. I did my first study abroad in Paris, and it was interesting to try to integrate into the community. I eventually found my way and had a really great experience. But then when I went to Germany, it was a very difficult experience to be Black there. I experienced a lot of discrimination and, you know, racial epithets and terrible things that just really made it difficult for me to look back on it as a fully positive experience. So I understand the students' concerns. What I will say, though, is that there are fantastic communities in all of these cities in Europe, and where you can engage with people of color. You can use the social media platforms that were not available when I was in college. I don't know how people really found each other before there was the internet, if you just show up in a place. But now there's social media. And, you know, I would actually offer these Fulbright platforms as a resource. These are Fulbrighters, but they're also just people who are abroad who like to talk about their experiences. There's one gentleman with Fulbright Noir who studied abroad. He was a Fulbrighter in Iceland doing scientific research. So I think, you know, don't feel bashful about reaching out, using those social media platforms. To go back to the Germany example, I really struggled to find the Afro-German communities when I first got to Germany. But now there's, you know, 5 or 10 Afro-German Instagram feeds where they have regular meetings and conversations. So I would say that there's a balance between taking that risk that everybody takes when they're going to a new place and they don't know anybody and they're not familiar with the culture, but also really being able to find a community and feel like there's some sense of belonging. Those issues in Europe, I think, are very particular as well, because there's a big rise in right-wing movements there, and a lot of people feel empowered to say and do racist things. So I think students can be really scared of that. But if you can help students build networks before they go and help walk them through that experience, and go through some of those scenarios. So, okay, what do you do if you are the victim of a racist attack? What are the steps that you can take? What can you do? What's your plan? That will really help the students to feel that they're prepared. If, God forbid, this happens, they have a way to go through it. And then, as I do, offer a resource in your office outside of just the program officer, but somebody who's a point of contact for those types of things. Somebody who is trained in multicultural identities, who can help respond to students if they experience that. Many counseling services are not equipped, and people are not trained for this specific thing. And I'm telling you right now that this is a new and important area of counseling study and college counseling research, because we don't want our students to be psychologically damaged from these experiences. And so we need to be able to help them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berger. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We did have a couple of questions we didn't get to, but I hope that our participants will have some future opportunities to engage with you and your new book. So thank you again for joining us today. Yeah,
what I can do is put up this slide. This is my contact information. If you want to contact me, I'm on Twitter and I have a website. So, I'll be doing book tours and events throughout the year. And, thank you again, Mariette. Thank you, Wyatt. Thank you, all the interpreters. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me today. It's been such a pleasure to be part of this community this afternoon. I wish you all so much luck in your social justice work. And I wish you all a happy International Education Week.